March 15th, 1623. Istanbul hasn't yet seen the first breath of dawn. The sky hangs in that ink-black hour, when even torches seem to drown in their own smoke. Inside Topkapı Palace, behind cedar doors carved in Lebanon and bound with Damascus iron, someone is screaming. Not the cry of birth, not grief, but something worse. The sound of a mind breaking while still awake. Outside, the guards, men who've seen battlefields, who've watched heads fall, who know the 1,000 ways a human being can suffer, take 3 steps back from the door. Later, one of them will write in a journal found centuries later in an Anatolian attic, "I've heard men die on the battlefield, but never that sound. It was the sound of a soul trying to escape its body." The girl screaming is 15. Her name is Fatma Sultan, daughter of the most powerful man alive, granddaughter of a woman who ruled an empire from behind latticed screens. 3 months earlier, she'd been writing essays on astronomy. Tonight, she's learning what it means to be currency in her father's empire. This isn't a story about a wedding night. It's about a machine, one engineered with chilling precision to turn living people into instruments of state policy. A system so refined, so deliberate in its cruelty, that modern psychological warfare looks crude beside it. What you're about to hear has been buried for 600 years in encrypted archives. The question isn't why it was hidden, it's how many more truths still are. Before we go on, I know you came here for the story, but listen, every view, every like, every subscription to Crimson Historians is a vote. A vote that says, yes. Show me the parts of history that hurt, the ones textbooks won't touch. Now back to Istanbul, back to the night that changed everything. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just powerful, it was the center of gravity for 3 continents. When Istanbul spoke, Venice listened. When the Sultan frowned, Vienna lost sleep. And deep within this empire, in the marble heart of Topkapı Palace, was the imperial harem. You've heard of it, but not the truth. It wasn't just a pleasure house. It was a shadow government, a labyrinth of women. The Sultan's mother, his wives, his daughters, and hundreds of enslaved girls, bound by rules more intricate than any European court. Some of them wielded real power, power that shaped wars. But that power came with a price, and for the Sultan's daughters, the cost was written into their very flesh. Fatma Sultan was born in 1606 to Sultan Ahmed I, and Kösem Sultan, a woman who ruled the empire for decades from behind the veil. Kösem made sultans, and unmade them too. But even she couldn't shield her daughter from the machinery she had helped to build. By 10, Fatma spoke 4 languages fluently. She debated scholars in Persian, wrote poetry in Arabic that made grown men uneasy, and discussed Greek philosophy straight from the source. Palace astronomers once noted that she asked questions about planetary motion that wouldn't be answered until Kepler's work reached Istanbul years later. She kept journals, dozens of them, filled with notes on lunar phases, sketches of mechanical inventions, and thoughts about time itself. One entry from December 1620 reads, "If the stars move in perfect circles, why does time feel like a spiral? Father says I think too much for a girl. Mother says nothing, but her eyes, they know something I don't. I wish the stars could warn me." They couldn't. In December 1622, Fatma is summoned to the inner chambers of the harem. No warning, no reason given. Her mother is there. Kösem Sultan, the woman who had survived poisonings and revolts, who had ruled longer than any man, sits upright, face unreadable. The message comes from Gulnar Hatun, a woman whose title doesn't quite exist in English. An architect of psychological destruction. She's been perfecting her art for 30 years. "The decision has been made," Gulnar says, voice flat as stone. You will marry Kara Mustafa Pasha. The ceremony will be on March 15th. Preparations begin tomorrow. Kara Mustafa Pasha, a commander 20 years older, his face marked by 3 wars. For him, this marriage is a reward, a political promotion. For Fatma, it's a death sentence in silk. She looks to her mother. Kursam's expression never shifts. That silence is the answer. What followed wasn't preparation for a wedding. It was erasure, methodical, deliberate, absolute. And here's the worst part. It nearly vanished from history. Someone, no, many someones, worked tirelessly to make sure you never heard this story. Every time you scroll past a story like this because it's too heavy, too dark, you're helping them win. You're helping the silence spread. If you believe the voices of the silenced deserve to be heard, stay with me, because forgetting is how history repeats itself. Now let's walk into that room, the one they called the Gelin Odası, the bride's chamber. The name is a lie. It wasn't a chamber, it was a laboratory. Every inch of it designed over generations to break a person from the inside out. The walls, panelled in dark ebony, chosen because it swallows light, makes the room feel smaller with every breath. The carpets thick enough to muffle footsteps. The windows sealed shut behind nailed shutters. The only light came from oil lamps placed at precise angles. Modern psychologists who've studied the old blueprints say the lighting created disorientation, bright enough to see, but impossible to tell time. You could never know how long you'd been inside. The walls were hung with tapestries, not for beauty, but indoctrination. Each one told a story from Islamic history, tales of ideal wives, women who gave everything in the name of obedience. The women on the walls all looked the same, heads bowed, eyes lowered, smiles shaped for someone else's comfort. They were painted lessons: obey, submit, disappear. It wasn't decoration. It was propaganda that never turned off, visual noise whispering obedience day and night. Then Gulnar Hatun entered. She moved like a school headmistress at an execution, 60 years old, carved from Cappadocian stone, eyes that didn't blink unless necessary. In her hands, a leather-bound book with no title. Inside, written in tight Ottoman script, were step-by-step instructions, not for torture, not for killing, but for breaking a mind while keeping the body intact. The manual had been refined for 80 years. Fatma was the 18th princess to endure this version. Stand, Gulnar said. For the next 4 hours, Fatma learned the 18 postures of humility. They weren't simple bows. Each one had a geometry, a language of its own. The greeting bow, a 30-degree neck tilt, hands below the heart, eyes to the ground. Message: I am grateful for your attention. The service bow, 45 degrees, palms turned upward. Message: I exist to meet your needs. The retiring bow, full prostration, forehead pressed to the floor. Message: I vanish when you wish it. 4 hours a day, every day, for 3 months. Modern kinesiologists who've analyzed the postures say they were designed to induce what's now called embodied submission, when the body learns obedience so completely that muscle memory overrides thought. By week 3, Fatma's body bowed before her mind could choose to. That was the point. Next, they came for her voice. 43 words. That's what her world was reduced to. Not 43 word types, but 43 exact phrases written on parchment. Yes, my lord. As you wish. Forgive my inadequacy. Thank you for your mercy. I am honored by your attention. 43 ways to erase yourself while still producing sound. Speak anything beyond those phrases, and punishment followed. The first time, fasting, 24 hours without food. The second, the reflection cell, pitch black, barely big enough to sit in, for 6 hours. The third, public humiliation, dragged before 300 women while senior concubines recited her failures, her arrogance, her unworthiness, her shame. By week 5, the girl who debated scholars couldn't form a sentence. Twice a week came the ritual called the lesson in perspective. It meant this: Fatma Sultan, daughter of the ruler of the world, was forced to personally serve her father's favorite concubines, not symbolically, literally. She washed them, combed their hair, dressed them for the nights they would spend with her father, fed them by hand like a servant tending queens. A young attendant, who later fled the palace, wrote what she saw. The princess trembled so violently while fastening Dija Sultan's ruby necklace that the gems clattered like dice in a bowl. She cried, but made no sound. It was like watching a ghost mourn its own death. This wasn't random cruelty. It was surgical psychological warfare, designed to annihilate her rank, her worth, her very sense of self. By week 8, Fatma's hands no longer trembled, not because she had accepted it, but because part of her had stopped existing. Beneath the harem, in chambers missing from any palace map, replicas of bridal suites had been built. Inside them stood mannequins, not crude figures, but disturbingly lifelike ones, crafted by Venetian artisans who normally made anatomical models for doctors. And twice a week, Fatma, 15 years old, already fractured, was brought there. Under the eyes of elderly women taking notes in Persian, she was made to rehearse scenarios no child should ever know existed. Every response recorded. Subject displayed fear. Extend session. Subject cried. Increase conditioning. Subject resisted. Double frequency. They were building a manual, a field guide for control, how to ensure a royal bride didn't resist her wedding night. In 2019, one of those manuals was discovered in the Topkapı archives. It read like a government torture report, cold, procedural, written with bureaucratic calm. A modern psychologist who reviewed it said, "It reads like a CIA manual from the 1950s, except this one was written in 1623. 7 days before the wedding, Fatma was moved to a small pavilion in the palace gardens, the Gelin Koşku, the bride's pavilion. No one entered or left. No sound penetrated. Her diet was measured by the ounce, not for health, for mood. Pomegranates, honey, almonds, goat's milk, spices from Yemen. Chemical tests on similar recipes show those spices contained natural sedatives, mild tranquilizers, precursors to modern anxiolytics. She bathed twice daily in water steeped with valerian root, poppy extract, and orange blossom, not for purity, but chemical sedation. Every wall was a mirror, Venetian glass, cut and placed to catch every angle. Wherever Fatma looked, she saw herself watching herself. The Sufis once used this as a spiritual practice, murakaba, self-observation to reach enlightenment. Here, it became a weapon. She became her own guard. On the final night, they gave her a special tea. The recipe was later found in the palace's medical archives: poppy milk, crushed mandrake root, and a third, unidentified compound that historians now believe was an early dissociative agent. It wasn't meant to make her sleep. It was meant to separate mind from body. As she drank, surrounded by endless reflections of herself, Fatma wrote her final journal entry just hours before. "Tonight the stars will still move. Tomorrow they'll still be there, but I won't see them anymore. Not really. The girl who loved the stars is becoming someone I don't know. Mother says this is what power means." If this is power, I'd rather be a slave with a soul. Then the fog rolled in, and the girl who loved stars stopped existing. March 15th, 1623. Istanbul celebrates. The whole city hums, processions winding through incense-thick streets, musicians from 3 continents competing to be heard. In Topkapı's banquet halls, cedar tables sag under towers of food, roasted lambs, honeyed pastries, fruit glittering under candlelight. The elite janissaries perform mock battles for the crowd, swords flashing like lightning in choreography that draws cheers. Coins are tossed, prisoners freed, the empire roars with joy. And in a quiet chamber nearby, Fatma Sultan sits motionless. Court physicians hover, taking notes. Pulse weak, skin cold despite braziers, eyes unfocused. Responds to sound but not language. Administered sedative tea as protocol dictates. Proceeding to ceremony. She's awake, but gone. As night falls, the crowds fade. The private ritual begins. The structure they use was built a century and a half earlier under Mehmed the Conqueror. 3 stories, octagonal, each level designed for a different phase of the rite. Fatma is led by candlelight through the gardens, dozens of women walking in silence. At the entrance, they stop. In that pause, 5 seconds at most, one young attendant later swore she heard Fatma whisper, not in Ottoman Turkish, in Greek, a prayer to Artemis, the virgin goddess, older than Islam, older than the empire. "Lady of the moon," she whispered, "if you can hear me, let me die before dawn." Then they entered. 3 hours in water, steaming with Damascus rose, jasmine, sandalwood, Somali amber. The oils they used weren't perfumes. Modern forensics show they contained opium derivatives, drugs that induce dissociative euphoria, a dream state where the body continues to move, but the mind retreats into darkness. The goal? A body that no longer resists while the mind quietly screams. One attendant wrote later, "The princess did not struggle. She did not speak. Her eyes were open, but she did not see us. It was like washing a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead. White silk embroidered with gold thread, pearls from the Gulf, a crown so heavy it bent her head down by sheer weight. But beneath that beautiful costume, something else, hidden, waiting." The cords tightened around her torso, keeping her from taking a full breath. The clasps were designed so the garment couldn't be removed without help. The jewelry, heavy and ornate, doubled as restraints. Even the shoes, thick-soled and unstable, made it impossible to run. The wedding dress wasn't clothing. It was a cage disguised as beauty. In another part of the palace, Kara Mustafa Pasha was receiving his own set of instructions. Senior officers, veterans of countless campaigns, trained him in phrases meant to establish dominance, in stances that communicated power, in techniques refined on battlefields. He wasn't being prepared for marriage, he was being prepared for conquest. The same methods he'd once used to break enemy commanders were now being taught for use on a 15-year-old girl. They called it Zayth, the Ascension. The chamber's walls were draped with tapestries showing the empire's triumphs. Cities burned, soldiers crushed, princesses captured. The message was unmistakable. What happens in war will happen here. The bed had hidden rope systems for safety. The cushions were soaked in sedative oils. Lighting was adjusted to control her emotions. Behind carved wooden screens waited the witnesses, physicians and scribes, there to record that the act was completed, that the machine worked as intended. What happened next was written in medical notes, sealed in Persian script for 6 centuries. I'm going to tell you what those notes say, not for shock value, but because forgetting these girls is exactly what the Empire wanted. The records describe total collapse within the first hour. Her body began trembling uncontrollably. Her voice vanished. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Her eyes rolled back, and consciousness flickered on and off. At first, the man thought her silence was defiance. He followed the instructions, used intimidation, but there was no reaction, not from compliance, but from absence. After 3 hours, more sedatives were administered. Physical consummation was achieved only once she entered what they called shock mute, a complete mental withdrawal. The body functioning, but the self gone. Today we'd call it dissociative shutdown, a defense mechanism the mind uses when trauma becomes too unbearable to survive. The consciousness abandons the body to escape what it cannot fight. The final note, written near dawn, documents internal injuries and multiple losses of consciousness. Her pulse barely registered. What they witnessed wasn't a wedding night, it was a death. They called it Ruhani Çıkmasa, the departure of the soul. Consummation achieved, marriage sealed, but the person who entered that room did not survive until morning. At sunrise, Istanbul celebrated a royal wedding, coins thrown to the crowds, prayers offered in mosques, poems written in praise. Inside the pavilion, Fatma sat in silence, eyes empty. The girl she had been was gone. Her body would live another 29 years, but the self that was Fatma died that night. And I need you to pause here. What you just heard isn't fiction. It's not exaggerated. It's preserved in medical journals, architectural plans, witness accounts. These girls were real. Their pain was real. And for 600 years, their suffering was buried on purpose. If you're still here, if you didn't scroll away because it's hard to hear, then you understand something most people don't. History isn't meant to comfort you. It's meant to wake you up. Subscribe to Crimson Historians, not for me, but for every Fatma whose story almost disappeared. That night was only the beginning. What came after revealed something far more disturbing. The morning after the wedding, the palace physicians were alarmed, not because something went wrong, but because everything went exactly as planned. Fatma had developed what they called selective mutism. She didn't speak. When directly ordered by her husband or his mother, Gulnar Hatun, she'd whisper a few permitted words, 43 phrases in total. But she never spoke freely again. Her appetite vanished. She had to be fed by attendants, food placed into her mouth, her throat massaged to make her swallow. Then came the episodes, hours-long crying fits where she shook violently but made no sound. Witnesses described it as watching someone drown in air. But worse than the silence was the fear. Any man, even one she'd known all her life, triggered collapse. She'd start gasping, trembling, fainting. Her father couldn't enter her chambers. Male servants were dismissed, guards reassigned. Her entire existence rebuilt around avoiding panic. Physicians tried everything: herbal medicines, music therapy, Sufi healing rituals, even magnetic treatments. Nothing worked. Because you can't heal a shattered mind by treating its cage. The girl who once filled notebooks with observations of the stars never opened them again. Her calligraphy tools gathered dust. The gardens she loved exploring became forbidden ground. Piece by piece, her identity vanished. The marriage continued on paper. There were children, 4 of them, conceived during encounters that the records describe with the same cold detachment as that first night. Subject entered dissociative state. Consummation achieved. Subject unresponsive for several hours. 4 children born to a mother who wasn't present in her own body. Publicly, she was the perfect wife. Dressed, silent, motionless, beside her husband at ceremonies. Privately, palace records tell a different story. Kara Mustafa Pasha spent more and more time away. Opium followed. Then other women. Some reports say he began volunteering for the most dangerous military fronts: Hungary, Persia, Yemen, as if distance was the only thing that could quiet what haunted him. A letter discovered in the Austrian military archives, written by Kara Mustafa Pasha to a fellow officer, reads, "They gave me a bride and called it a reward. What they gave me was a ghost wearing a crown. I cannot look at her without seeing what I was made to do. Send me to the frontier. Send me anywhere. Let me die in battle like a soldier, not in shame like a coward." He was haunted. She was destroyed. And the empire called it a success. Fatma lived for 29 more years, half alive, half gone, a ceremonial figure, a vessel for political heirs, a living warning of what happens when a woman's worth is measured only in obedience. On March 15th, 1652, exactly 29 years to the day after her wedding, she died. The physicians wrote brain fever as the cause, but the timing wasn't coincidence. Palace attendants whispered that on that anniversary, she decided she'd carried the weight long enough. After 29 years of haunting her own life, she finally gave herself permission to rest. Her death was marked with the proper rituals, then forgotten. The Ottoman records reduce her to a single line: Fatma Sultan, wife of Kara Mustafa Pasha, mother of 4, died in 1652. She was noted for her piety and obedience. The astronomer was erased, the artist erased, the brilliant, curious mind replaced by 2 acceptable words: pious and obedient. That's the version they wanted remembered, and that's exactly what we're here to correct. What chills me most about this story isn't only that it happened, it's how perfectly it worked. The Ottoman court understood something modern psychology wouldn't formally define for centuries. The most effective control isn't physical restraint. It's the kind of psychological conditioning that makes a person imprison themselves, the kind that turns rebellion into something their own mind refuses to allow. They built a machine, a system engineered to break human will, and it ran smoothly for almost 300 years, with only minor updates. At least 37 royal women went through this same process between 1530 and 1826. 37 brilliant, educated, powerful women, each dismantled with the same precision. And the system didn't end with the Ottomans. Versions of it existed everywhere, under different names. In imperial China, foot-binding wasn't about beauty, it was about immobility. In Europe, elite families created their own marriage rituals, less documented but just as cruel, where breaking a daughter's will was considered preparation. Across empires, across centuries, the method was the same: turn a person into an instrument. What disturbs me most isn't the cruelty, it's the cover-up. The same system that destroyed these women also erased them from history. It replaced screams with ceremonies, trauma with triumph, victims with beloved wives. For 600 years, that official version went unchallenged. It wasn't until 2019, 21st century researchers digging through sealed archives, that the truth finally emerged. Think about that. It took 600 years to piece together what really happened behind those walls, so how many other truths are still buried? How many voices are still silent? How many royal weddings have you read about without asking what that phrase meant for the bride? Fatma Sultan's story is a reminder. History isn't just the tale of empires and victories, it's also the echo of those who were silenced, the record of pain that power tried to erase, the truth that survived because someone, somewhere, refused to stop looking. When we recover these stories, we do more than fill gaps in history. We restore humanity. We speak the names that power wanted forgotten. We refuse to let suffering disappear just because it's inconvenient for the people who caused it. There's a letter, found in French archives, written by Fatma Sultan, Fatma's mother. It reads, "I have ruled empires from the shadows. I have made sultans and unmade them. I have survived assassins and outlasted enemies. But I could not protect my daughter from the machine I helped build. That is the price of power. You feed the machine, and one day it feeds on you." What you've just heard is one of history's darkest truths, a ritual meant to create perfect obedience that became systematic psychological torture. A wedding night turned into a lifelong sentence. A girl who dreamed of charting the stars spent 29 years as a ghost inside her own body. If that makes you angry, it should. If it makes you think about how many stories like hers were buried, then you understand why we're here. If you believe the voices that power tried to silence deserve to be heard, then subscribe to Crimson Historians. Leave a comment naming another royal woman whose hidden story should be told next. Because the most dangerous thing about history isn't what we don't know. It's what we were never meant to know. Until next time, keep questioning what you've been told. The truth is always darker, stranger, and far more human than the official version allows. After Fatma's death, the palace didn't stop. It couldn't. The machine had become self-sustaining, a ritualized bureaucracy of obedience dressed up as tradition. Every new generation of women born into the dynasty entered the same cycle, the same books, the same rules, the same silent screams echoing through mirrored chambers. But something was changing, slowly, invisibly, like the shifting of a tectonic plate deep beneath the earth. By the late 17th century, whispers began to spread among the palace tutors and scribes, the ones tasked with educating the royal daughters before their training began. A few of them started making copies of the forbidden texts Fatma had once written, her star charts, her notes on lunar movement, her sketches of constellations, tiny fragments hidden between religious verses or pressed between pages of prayer books, smuggled out of the palace one by one. Those fragments survived. Centuries later, modern historians would use them to reconstruct the map Fatma had drawn of the night sky as it looked from her window in the harem, a sky she was forbidden to look at after her wedding. And that's how resistance began, not with rebellion or blood, but with memory. Memory is the enemy of every empire that rules by fear. By the early 1700s, the Ottoman court had perfected the illusion of peace. The system still ran, smooth, efficient, invisible. The training manuals expanded into full institutions. The obedience schools beneath the palace became formal academies for noble girls. Their purpose, officially, was refinement, etiquette, music, philosophy. Unofficially, they were psychological laboratories. The empire learned to disguise cruelty as culture. Paintings from that era show calm, graceful women seated beside fountains, eyes lowered, hands folded, serenity carved into submission. European travelers who visited Istanbul wrote admiringly about the discipline and grace of Ottoman women. They didn't know they were looking at ghosts. The system adapted with time. When open punishment fell out of favor, it was replaced with social isolation. When physical coercion became scandalous, they invented spiritual obedience, a distortion of Sufi teachings, reworded to convince women that submission was a divine act. One scholar called it a theology of silence. And it worked for another 100 years, until the 19th century, when cracks began to appear. Industrialization, Western contact, new ideas about education, all of it seeped in through the edges of empire. And in 1826, when the Janissaries were massacred in the auspicious incident, their old records were seized. Among them were coded medical documents, the same kind used to record Fatma's conditioning. For the first time, men in power saw in writing what had been done to their daughters, sisters, and wives for generations. Some were horrified, others pretended not to see. But the truth was out, and it couldn't be fully hidden again. Still, the empire tried. They burned records, destroyed manuals, rebuilt sections of the palace to erase the underground chambers. But not everything burned. In 1911, when the Ottoman Empire was already crumbling, an archivist working in Topkapı Palace found a small box inside a locked cabinet. Inside were 3 items: a tiny leather-bound notebook written in a teenage girl's hand, a fragment of star chart, and a note, unsigned, written in Ottoman Turkish. "If they ever find this, tell them the stars were real." The handwriting matched other samples from Fatma Sultan's early years. That's how history finally began to turn. When Turkey became a republic, the palace archives opened, cautiously, selectively. Most people ignored the darker records. They wanted a clean story, a glorious empire, not a haunted one. But a few researchers, mostly women, started digging. Piece by piece they unearthed what the empire tried to erase: the manuals, the journals, the testimonies. By 2019, it was all there, 600 years of buried truth, recovered. What Fatma endured was not an isolated tragedy. It was a prototype, a manual for control that echoes through time. You can still see its fingerprints everywhere, in systems that dress obedience as virtue, in traditions that romanticize silence, in cultures that teach girls to disappear politely. History changes its costumes, but the script doesn't always change. The only thing that breaks the cycle is remembering. So the next time you see an old painting of a royal wedding, or read a line about a dutiful princess, ask yourself, who wrote that? And whose voice was left out? Fatma's story isn't just Ottoman history, it's a mirror. It reflects every system that ever taught women to call their own erasure grace. And that's why we tell it. Not to relive the horror, but to reclaim the truth. Because every time one forgotten name is spoken again, the machine loses power. You're part of that process now. If you've made it this far, you're already defying what history expected. Keep watching. Keep questioning. Keep remembering. The story of Fatma Sultan isn't over, because memory never dies quietly. By the mid-1800s, the Ottoman court had turned obedience into art. Every gesture, every word, every breath of the palace women was choreographed. They were raised to perform submission so flawlessly that even rebellion began to look graceful. The manuals that once taught physical postures evolved into etiquette guides, books bound in gold leaf, their cruelty disguised as refinement. They taught how to stand in the presence of men, how to lower the gaze without appearing timid, how to smile just enough to reassure without inviting conversation. A science of silence, centuries old, perfected. But cracks never truly seal. They only hide. Within those same walls, younger women began to study secretly. Some learned to read European texts brought in by translators. Others practiced writing under the guise of embroidery, tracing letters with needle and thread, stitching forbidden words into fabric. A few of those linens still exist, preserved in museum collections, patterns that look decorative until you realize they're coded. Hidden inside the floral curves are fragments of poems, equations, even political statements. Resistance lived in thread, not ink. Among those quiet rebels was a woman named Ayşe Sultan, Fatma's great-grandniece. She was born into the same dynasty, educated under the same system, expected to live the same fate. But she was different. From her childhood letters, historians know she studied mathematics, astronomy, and Persian poetry. Her tutors warned she was too curious. In palace language, that meant dangerous. By 17, Aisha had already learned the story of Fatma in whispers. The name wasn't supposed to be spoken, but every generation kept a shadow version of the tale, told at night, in candlelight, as a warning and a promise. The girls called her the one who loved the stars. Aisha's rebellion wasn't dramatic. There were no shouts, no broken chains. She simply began to write. In 1847, she composed a small book titled Reflections on Celestial Harmony. It posed philosophical questions about the soul and the cosmos, ideas she disguised as commentary on astronomy. Hidden within the metaphors were radical ideas about women's autonomy. The book somehow escaped the palace censors and circulated quietly in Istanbul's intellectual salons. It was never officially attributed to her, but her handwriting was later matched to the surviving manuscript. She had used the same phrase Fatma once wrote, "The stars are real." That echo across 2 centuries, one silenced girl and one who dared to answer her, marked the first tremor in a system that had seemed indestructible. By the 1860s, Ottoman reformers began to talk publicly about women's education, literacy, moral instruction. They didn't realize the movement had already started inside the palace, hidden behind curtains and prayer books. It wasn't imported from Europe. It was born in the quiet defiance of girls who refused to let their ancestors vanish. Still, the empire resisted change. The ceremonies continued. The obedient schools still trained young women, though by now the rituals had softened into manners. But trauma doesn't need violence to survive. It just needs repetition. Even as modernization swept through Istanbul, gas lamps replacing candles, steamships crowding the Bosphorus, newspapers spreading the language of progress, the inner world of the harem remained frozen in ritual. Outside, the empire crumbled. Inside, women still bowed to ghosts. And yet, every secret act of defiance, every stitched poem, every coded letter, every forbidden question added up. A silent accumulation of courage. When the empire finally fell in the early 20th century, it wasn't just because of politics or war. It fell because its mythology of control had already started to rot from the inside. Fatma's story wasn't forgotten after all. It lived in whispers, in the margins, in the unseen hands of women who refused to let obedience be their only inheritance. And by the time historians found her name again, they were discovering more than a person. They were uncovering the buried heartbeat of resistance that had been pulsing quietly beneath the empire's marble floors all along. When the empire finally died, its palaces became museums. The rooms that once echoed with protocol now smelled of dust and tourists' footsteps. The tapestries were catalogued, the portraits cleaned, the records boxed and forgotten again, this time under the label of heritage. But some ghosts don't fade with new governments, they adapt. In the 1920s, as the new republic tried to redefine itself, modern, rational, forward-looking, women were suddenly visible in public life. They taught in schools, published newspapers, joined reform clubs. Yet, in their private diaries, many wrote of feeling haunted by the silences that preceded us. In 1931, an archivist named Halid Ferhan, working through the remnants of the imperial harem's document collection, found a fragment that changed her life. It was a single page, a letter written in Ottoman Turkish, faint and water-damaged. At the bottom was a name she didn't recognize, Fatma bint Ahmed. The signature matched an old palace record, a princess, born 1623, deceased 1652. The letter itself was unfinished. It spoke of stars, of a promise, of something that would outlive the walls that hold me. Halad translated it by hand, one ink stroke at a time. Her notes in the margins read, "This is not just history, this is testimony." But the new republic didn't want ghosts. It wanted symbols of progress, not reminders of captivity. So Haliate's discovery sat unpublished for nearly 50 years, passed quietly among scholars who understood what it meant, because to tell Fatma's story was to admit that progress wasn't clean, that liberation came with echoes of women who never got the chance to live it. By the 1970s, Turkish feminist historians began revisiting those hidden archives. They found the same letter, the same name, and the same absence. There were no portraits of Fatma, no confirmed artifacts, not even a verified grave. All that survived was her handwriting, a few pages of ink and silence. And yet, that was enough. Her words began appearing in essays, then exhibitions, then university lectures. The stars are real. 3 words that once whispered rebellion in the 17th century became a rallying cry for women who refused to be forgotten in the 20th. Artists started painting her face from imagination, half myth, half reconstruction. Poets wrote of her as the astronomer who looked past her prison. By the 1990s, a generation of Turkish women began calling Fatma Sultan their invisible ancestor. And maybe that's what survival really means. Not monuments or medals, but memory that refuses to stay buried. Today, you can visit the Topkapı archives and find the faded document labeled Anonymous Female Astronomer, 17th Century. If you look closely, you'll see the corner of the page burned, the ink bleeding like a constellation. A note beside it reads simply, possibly Fatma Sultan. Verification pending. It's fitting, isn't it? Even in rediscovery, she remains half seen, still defying the neat categories of history. Because Fatma's legacy was never about fame or royal lineage. It was about endurance, about surviving the machinery of silence long enough to be heard centuries later, and in that way, she did what the empire never intended. She escaped. Now, centuries later, the story returns, not through royal archives or dusty libraries, but through the glow of screens. What once travelled in whispers now moves through data. Each recovered letter, each translated word, lives again in code, algorithms, and search results. The ghosts have learned to adapt to technology. In 2019, a team of digital historians from Vienna and Istanbul used spectral imaging to examine old Ottoman manuscripts long thought to be ceremonial scripts. What they found stunned them. Faint astronomical sketches, coded annotations, and a recurring symbol, a 6-pointed star drawn in Fatma's hand. The notes referenced constellations, calendar cycles, and celestial alignments recorded decades before European astronomers published them. For the first time, they could prove she wasn't a myth. Fatma Sultan had been an actual scientist, erased, renamed, and replaced. The discovery made international news for a day, and then silence again. Algorithms buried the headline under celebrity gossip and political drama within hours. History's cruelty wasn't just in how it silenced her, it's in how easily we still let truth vanish. But here's the difference. This time, she isn't entirely gone. Every person who reads her name, who searches for her story, who shares her words, becomes part of the countercurrent that history tried to drown. That's what this channel, this project, this moment is about, refusing the silence, because history isn't dead. It's archived, and archives can be opened. When you scroll through records, read forgotten letters, or even listen to stories like this one, you're performing an act of rebellion, the same quiet defiance that began in a palace centuries ago. You're proving that memory can't be erased if enough people refuse to look away. Fatma Sultan isn't just a figure from the 1600s. She's every woman who was told to be silent, every scholar whose name was left off the book, Every voice that the official version decided didn't fit the story. And if you're listening now, really listening, then her experiment worked. Her belief that the stars were real, that truth could survive even in darkness, that memory was stronger than obedience, all of it has found its way here. Through time, through empire, through silence. You're the proof that she was right, because history doesn't end in archives. It ends and begins again with those who dare to remember. So if this story moved you, if it made you question what else might still be buried, then don't just listen. Help uncover the next one. Share it. Comment. Research. Ask questions. Every act of curiosity is resistance. Because the most dangerous thing about history isn't forgetting. It's believing that the silence was ever natural. Until next time, keep questioning what you're told. Because truth, like starlight, never really disappears. It only takes time to reach us. The cords cinching her waist made breathing a measured act. Clasps locked the garment so tightly it couldn't be removed without help. The jewelry wasn't just decoration, it was weighted restraint. The shoes, unsteady and thick-soled, made running impossible. The wedding dress wasn't a symbol of love. It was a cage built to look like beauty. In another chamber, Kara Mustafa Pasha was receiving his own lessons, not about tenderness, but dominance. Veteran generals, men who'd commanded armies and crushed cities, were teaching him how to conquer a bride the same way he'd conquered a battlefield. They rehearsed the stance, the phrases, the intimidation. This wasn't a wedding, it was an operation. The walls around him were draped in tapestries of victory, burning cities, kneeling prisoners, captured queens. The message was clear. What happens in war will happen here. The bed had been modified with hidden restraints, pillows soaked in sedative oils, lighting engineered to disorient. Behind carved wooden screens, witnesses and physicians waited. Their duty, not compassion, but documentation. To confirm the ritual was completed, to make sure the machine worked. The notes they wrote that night were locked in Persian script and sealed for 6 centuries. I'm going to tell you what they said, not because it's entertainment, but because silence was part of the empire's weapon. The records describe a collapse, body trembling, voice gone, eyes rolling back, mind drifting in and out. At first, they mistook it for defiance, so they increased the force. 3 hours in, her body stopped resisting, not because she accepted, but because her consciousness retreated, shock mute, dissociative shutdown. When trauma becomes unbearable, the mind escapes to survive. By dawn, her pulse was faint. The physicians wrote, "Physical consummation achieved." Subject unresponsive. What they witnessed wasn't a wedding night. It was what they called Ruhani Chukmasa, the departure of the soul. The body survived. The person did not. When morning broke, Istanbul celebrated. Coins scattered in the streets. Poets praised the union. But inside the pavilion, Fatma Sultan sat motionless, a living echo of the girl who had died hours before. Her body would continue for 29 more years. Her spirit ended that night. What you've just heard isn't fiction, it's documented. Medical journals, eyewitness accounts, architectural blueprints. The empire buried these truths because that's what power does. It buries the evidence. But erasing pain doesn't undo it. And you're still here, listening. That means something. Because history isn't meant to comfort, it's meant to wake you up. The morning after, the palace physicians were confused, not because something went wrong, but because it went exactly as intended. Fatma didn't speak again. They called it selective mutism. She responded only in whispers, reciting the 43 approved phrases she'd been taught. Her appetite vanished. She was fed by a hand like an infant.
And then the crying began, hours of silent sobbing, her body convulsing without sound. Attendants said it was like watching someone drown in air. But worse than the crying was the fear. Any man, even her father, triggered collapse, panic, shaking, gasping. They called it fear sickness. We call it trauma. Physicians tried everything: herbs, music, magnets, prayers. Nothing worked, because you can't heal a shattered mind by treating the body. Her journals, once filled with notes on astronomy, were locked away. Her calligraphy tools collected dust. The gardens she loved became prisons she refused to enter. The girl who once mapped stars became a ghost confined to palace walls. Her marriage continued in name. 4 children were born, each conception recorded with the same detached language. Subject entered dissociative state. Consummation achieved. She appeared at royal events, silent and still, like a porcelain doll, a symbol of obedience, a mask for political convenience. Kara Mustafa began requesting longer deployments, wars in Hungary, Persia, Yemen. He turned to opium, then to other women. Letters from the Austrian archives reveal his torment. They gave me a bride and called it a reward. What they gave me was a ghost wearing a crown.
Send me to the frontier. Let me die in battle, not in shame. He was haunted. She was destroyed, and the empire called it a successful marriage. Fatma lived 29 more years in that half-death. A ceremonial figure, a vessel for heirs, a living lesson in obedience. On March 15th, 1652, exactly 29 years to the day, she died of what physicians called brain fever. But everyone in the palace knew it wasn't fever, it was release. After 29 years of surviving the memory, she decided she'd carried enough of it. Her death was recorded in a single line: Fatma Sultan, wife of Kara Mustafa Pasha, mother of 4, noted for piety and obedience. The astronomer, erased. The artist, erased. The thinker, erased. Only the obedient woman remained. That was the point. The Ottomans understood something psychology would name centuries later. The most powerful control isn't physical restraint. It's conditioning that makes rebellion impossible. They built a system that trained women to surrender before they even realized it. And it worked for nearly 300 years. At least 37 documented princesses endured similar preparation between 1530 and 1826, each one broken in the same precise way. And it wasn't just the Ottomans. China's foot binding, Europe's bridal rites, India's child marriages, all different masks for the same idea: turn a human being into property. Dress control in ceremony, call it beauty. Call it virtue. Call it destiny. What unsettles me most isn't that it happened. It's how perfectly it was hidden. Centuries of chroniclers turned screams into songs, trauma into triumph, victims into saints. Until 2019, when researchers finally decoded the records sealed for 600 years, that's when the truth resurfaced. And even then, it barely made the news. A single headline for one day, and gone. Because even now we bury women quietly. We just use algorithms instead of ink. But this time, silence doesn't win. Because now her story is here, read, watched, spoken aloud. And every person who hears her name keeps her alive a little longer. Fatma Sultan isn't just a girl from the 1600s. She's every woman told to stay quiet. Every mind rewritten by those who feared its brilliance. Every name history tried to erase. And if you're listening now, really listening, then she made it. Her words crossed centuries of dust and denial to reach you. That means her light never went out. Because history doesn't end in archives. It ends with us, with those who dare to remember. If this story shook you, if it made you angry that her voice was stolen for 600 years, then don't look away. Ask, question, share. Every act of curiosity pushes back against the silence. The most dangerous thing about history isn't forgetting, it's believing the silence was ever natural. Until next time, keep questioning what you're told, because truth, like starlight, never disappears. It just takes time to reach us.